What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. We're at it again, finally, with another episode. This one, I've got some explaining to do. So, first and foremost, obviously, we're out of the shop space. We had to be out March 1st. So, me, my store, my tools, and Lily here, we are temporarily sitting in my mom and dad's garage. This is where I'm going to be able to hopefully finish putting my store together over the next week and a half. Yeah, and she should have been done, but I'll get into the reasons why it's not done here in a second. To top that all off, I'm also officially out of my apartment, committing to moving into the RV to start doing the racing on the East Coast and central parts of the United States. But enough of the boring things, let's cover why we're here and why we didn't make it to Buttonwillow. So first and foremost, obviously my dampers are missing. And that's because, well, one of the unfortunate things is we only had so much when it came to how far the car was assembled, how far everything fit together when we were doing the best we could with mocking up the shock absorbers that PSI built me. The further along I got, we started seeing little fitment issues, and the fitment issue I found was big enough that thankfully PSI is going to rework the structure of the dampers so we don't have the interference problem. But that's obviously just going to be one of those things that takes time, and taking time means we lost Buttonwillow. But clearly, even without the dampers, you can see right in front of you, the car just isn't done. And I've made a lot of good progress, but we're still just not completely done assembling the car as hard as I tried. Now, rather than just keep rushing to get the car done, my main fundamental focus has been I want to put the car together right so I can have the confidence to travel and feel that I'm going to be able to successfully compete or drive or whatever, and not constantly be trying to chase things I could have solved right here in the comfort of my mom and dad's garage. But the good news is I'm really close to being done. As you see it right now, we still have a minor issue with a barometric pressure sensor. We still have some exhaust pieces that are coming that are critical. We're still waiting on the dampers. We need to finish making the dry sump tank mount. I need to make one more oil line, and we need to create a seat back for the front side of my fuel cell. But besides that, she's just about done. But enough about what's left to do on the car. Why don't we show you how we got to this point right here, right now. So thankfully, Kevin was able to get these two in and out hoses welded onto my swirl pot. That allowed me to go ahead and finish off the install and cut both the silicone and the aluminum tubing to length. But there's one other thing I had to do a permanent install on, and that was my radiator ducting. Obviously, we made that beautiful radiator inlet ducting, which you guys can check out in a previous video. But up to this point, I honestly haven't truly bolted it to the aluminum panel. So that's what we've got to do right here. But once the swirl pot, the engine, and the radiator are permanently located in their final positions, we can finalize and final cut to length all of the tubing and the silicone hose needed to supply both the radiator and the engine. So one of the cool tricks I learned along the way was finding a way to use Gates heat shrink hose clamps. Obviously, you don't get to use them everywhere, but when you're making hoses out of multiple pieces, it really helps cut down on just little possibilities of failure. Why? Because, well, it's heat shrink, and as you run the car, the heat shrink's activated, so it's always trying to do a little bit of clamping. And what you can see here is, well, instead of having 4 hose clamps on this particular part, I'd only need 2. So now we get to move on to the right side of the car and move on to the oiling system. Now we've got to install the ducting just like we did on the other side, using a couple of rib nuts in the panel to help make sure I locate and hold the radiator duct in place. Now, beyond that, there's one additional step we're going to take when installing the oiling system. That's installing the exhaust. We don't need all the exhaust in place, but we want to have at least a header in there just to give us an idea as to where all of the exhaust components will be, because the oil fittings are going to come out the front of the motor for the oil cooler. But once we get that header in, we're going to move on and start working on getting the feed and the return lines located, cut, and installed for the dry sump tank. Now, we're still betting pretty big on making sure that the dry sump tank on the back of the Hayabusa is going to work out, but I have faith. So I ended up getting the vice jaws to make AN lines as a contingent for getting a different product. If you're ever building AN lines, get these things. They're worth their weight in gold. Now you can see how short that hose is that's going to be the feed line going to the dry sump intake. But now we get to start running the hose that's going to run all the way around the other side of my motor. This is going to scavenge the engine oil out of the engine and to the top of the dry sump tank. The reason we're running it completely around the motor is I just don't want to run any oil lines near or around the chain. For a lot of reasons. A, the chain throws a lot of debris. It also has the ability to strike oil lines, hoses, and fittings and stuff like that. So the safe thing is run it around the front of the motor and up the right-hand side of the motor to the back and the top of the tank. So one of the things we had to do was kind of grab the dry sump tank and lean it back a little bit, and that's going to allow us to clear the airbox for the Stohr WF1. So my race car ain't going to go nowhere with ain't no gas in it. So we've got to put the fuel cell in, and we've got to put in all the fittings that I made and install it finally underneath my seat back. Now I did end up getting a brand new heat shield that's going to go between my fuel cell and the back of the frame there and help protect it from heat. And of course, I'm doing one final clean to make sure everything underneath the fuel cell is as clean as possible. Now I also like putting some tape underneath the fuel cell, and that's because that allows any kind of dirt or grime that's really tiny to get edged up against that tape and not just sit as a burr underneath the fuel cell. Without cleaning out all of those lines, all that dirt and debris would have gotten shoved right into my ejectors. So of course, we're cleaning every AN line as clean and as thoroughly as possible to make sure that no debris gets into my fuel system or my oiling system. Now, one of the things we've left to the very end is installing the shifting system for my Stohr WF1. Right here, we're putting the pneumatic ram that's going to basically take the standard mechanical shifting up and down of the Hayabusa engine and transition it into a pneumatic shifting. Now, we're going to put in the Shift Tech valve body that's going to handle the upshifts, the downshifts, and the blipper. But we've got to run hoses to all the different locations. Now, the blipper, as you saw, is up and located by my ECU and my PDU, and it's going to impact the throttle cable, more importantly, the actual sheathing of the throttle cable to activate the blip. Now that we got all the lines made, we just get to run them to both the respective locations on the valve body and the component they need to move. So now all that's left is doing the wiring for the charging system and finishing off the suspension. Now the wiring system's pretty easy. It's a rectifier stator system, and you just got to wire it into the battery. But as you can see, I finally have to drill the holes and install the push rods for the front suspension. Now, even though these push rods aren't the permanent fix because we just temporarily tack them in place, we want to make sure that they're the right length before we go ahead and fully weld them. So while I was down with Dave and Ellen at Verocity Racing Data, I didn't do the best job making the recordings. Now, we went down there with a goal to accomplish a lot, and we accomplished a massive amount. Most importantly, we at least got the ECU and PDU communicating effectively with the Motec dash via the CAN bus. So information's now flowing back and forth between both the ECU and the Motec dash. We also had to do some wiring, and Dave made an excellent what we'll call octopus. So now the CAN bus is shared and the power is shared from my Motec dash to my SmartyCam and the Flagtronics unit. Now we were also hoping to get a little bit better runtime on the motor and try to fire it up. but unfortunately we had an oil leak and we just couldn't seem to get everything working right. But this is what we got. So the main reason we weren't able to really fire off and run the car with Dave and Ellen was fundamentally because we had an oil leak. Now I'll show you about that here in a second. But beyond that, the reason the car would fire and not continue to run was for two reasons. One, we weren't able to plug in the barometric pressure sensor. Since then, I actually had to swap it out the connector on the ECU wiring harness. And secondly, well, I really didn't do a good enough job training the throttle position sensor. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but we're not running a manifold pressure sensor, so we're depending heavily on the TPS. So beyond the issues that were somehow related to the electronics, this was my big problem. Now, this is an adapter that bolts to the side of the motor and converts the oil outfitting to an AN line. And for whatever reason, this face here just didn't want to seal. So thankfully, John put this back in the machine, recut this beveled edge, so hopefully now this will no longer be a problem. So that's going to be it for this video. More is coming soon. This will be the biggest delay in between videos I will probably have for a long time. But needless to say, moving out of the shop and moving out of my apartment turned out to be quite the undertaking. At least I'm leaving you here with a good little video of Liliu listening to and watching the squirrels. So have a great rest of your night, and thank you for watching.